All right, so we had introduced the Agile methodology as a contrast to the waterfall methodology, and as a having identified the waterfall having some lacking some or having some problems. Now these problems have really arisen a little bit on because of how the industry the way it's moving. That especially in a competitive environment where you have in a competitive industry where everybody's trying to outdo each other and provide a number of features that to steal some clients from you and steal some of your business. Businesses have to adapt and introduce other features that are from the pressures that they have from their competitors. In other industries or perhaps in government where things might move a little slower and you might not have all this competitive pressures, perhaps waterfall still might be okay. In a domain that is fairly mature, that is fairly understood, where the requirements don't change quite as violently, waterfall might still be relevant. But in a changing environment where things are changing, it's chaotic, Agile has proven to be much more desirable. It allows us to be much more flexible. It thrives in chaos, right? As opposed to in waterfall, it's really adverse at chaotic environments. Where in waterfall you might be much more heavy on the documentation side. In Agile, we're much more lighter. We only do documentation on a need base, right? Only if there's something that we can't agree or we don't understand using verbal communication, we might use some diagrams that we might draw on a screen for us to better communicate amongst each other. But we don't really do documentation for documentation doesn't have any value on its own. Right? It's especially since documentation tends to be stale and be out of date by the time you actually are going to implement it. Right? Things might have changed by the time you actually get to it. So there's no point in going in and doing any documentation a priori. So basically, the contrast between the two methodologies is that yes, there are distinct set of tasks that a project has, such as planning, analyzing, designing, coding, testing. Whereas a waterfall, it tends to be a one-shot and have a big bang solution at the end. We instead tend to break these into much smaller chunks and just repeat those iterations over and over, providing these intermediate steps or results for review for the stakeholder, so that they can see progress, they can give us some feedback, and put us back into the direction they might want. Right? If we want to go from A to B, right, and we stray away from that particular direction, right, multiple feedback from the users might put us back in line of where our direction is. Or B might actually change over time, right? Where is it that we want to go? And as the requirements change over time, and then we might have to change directions as we go. So does it mean that Agile doesn't document? No, I mean we do document, especially if it's required by law or we have some interaction with some authority or some governmental agency that needs some documentation. Or we document only as a need base, right? Only on just in time, only as a matter of communication. Some of the benefits is that we're okay with requirements changing, that they're not frozen, that many of these requirements will be discovered as we start implementation, as we learn more about the domain object, and as we also deal better with risks. That if we don't know a particular technology or how something works, we can. The process allows us to do some research or designs tasks to have folks just spend some time, go off and learn a particular technique, and then report back to the team and disseminate that with the rest of the folks, so that we can be more confident that we can actually deliver on certain requirements. Also, we keep the client tightly tied to the whole process so that they can give us feedback. They feel more comfortable seeing some tangible results over time. Right? Every 2 weeks they see progress. They see that they're actually they're seeing something already displayed on a particular user interface. Is, oh yeah, there's my button that I asked for last week. Right? So they can see that as a much faster feedback. Now, Agile methodology doesn't necessarily apply all the time. Depends on the size of the team and how well the team is the experience in the team as well. It works better in smaller teams. No more than 8 to 10 folks working in the same team. The organization might have multiple teams. Each team spread out, broken up into 8 to 10 folks. We have three folks per team. So maybe Agile might be an overkill for such a small team. But nevertheless, it's I wanted to be able to play around with dependencies within the team and also dependencies across teams and see how the team dynamics works there. Also, the Agile works better when we're all co-located geographically, perhaps working next to each other, in the same table, looking over each other's shoulders and looking at each other's screens. And we might tag team, working together and see each other's work. And perhaps I might commit something and ask you to merge it, and then right there you're there to review it right away and merge it right away and work better together. It doesn't work as well in a distributed environment where you have folks working in remote, overseas perhaps. If you have folks working remotely or overseas, the communication breaks down, right? You now start needing to have much more documentation, right? Where as opposed to having back and forth discussions and explaining things, you might have to do a lot more diagrams and explicitly ask what things have to be built, especially because we might not be in the same time zone, and we just have we need to deal more with asynchronous communication as opposed to synchronous communication. Smaller teams is better, and when the teams are novices, it's also much more challenging to use Agile. Scrum is one specific type of Agile, and it's by far the most common type of Agile, and just adds some constraints to the Agile methodology. One of the constraints is that it time boxes most of its activities. So, for instance, whenever we're going to be working, we're going to be typically defining a sprint or a time box of 15 days to 30 days, 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, where we're going to be focusing on one particular set of tasks, right? And usually we don't allow new tasks to be added to the sprint, and we commit usually to only those tasks that we are fairly confident that we're going to be able to deliver within that allotted time. Typically, we have someone who's responsible for managing the communication amongst the team, and if there are questions or doubts, typically the Scrum Master will gather all these questions and all these doubts and meet with the stakeholders and then come back and report with the team with those answers. Typically, at the end of a sprint, there is a retrospective where folks vent out what went right, what went wrong, what they liked, what they didn't like of the process. That some of the decisions on certain stories perhaps was the wrong decisions. Maybe somebody chose to add 2 stories that were dependent on each other, like we did, right? We added 3 things that depend on each other, that team members have to wait on each other. Yes. So usually developers don't like that, right? That I couldn't get to work because on the page because the design wasn't ready, or the icons weren't ready, or the background wasn't ready, or the API wasn't there, so I had to mock I couldn't test it, right? So I only tested it locally, but I can't deploy it because the API is not there yet, right? So all these events are part of the retrospective, and the Scrum Master or the project manager captures all this information and sees what could we do better next time, right? So that we identify what we want to keep doing and with the things that we want to stop doing, right? What worked well and what didn't work. Also, we review the backlog and see all the things that we still need to work and identify for the next sprint. A lot of focus on collaboration, right? Where we would just, if we don't understand something, we just talk it out. No need to document anything, right? Typically, all the documentation is live on the code. Is right on the code. So hopefully the code is self-explanatory, or we add enough documentation on the code that we can run, Java docs, or that can generate all this automated documentation for us, as opposed to having to explicitly draw class diagrams and sequence diagrams and do some formal documentation. We're going to do some of that enough to not want to do that ever again. But again, it's important enough to know how to do it if we need to. Only if we need to would we document something, only to make sure we're all on the same page. Also, a lot of focus on testing. We haven't done much testing just yet. There's a whole lecture on testing a little later. But heavy making sure that if something, if we finish something, we know we're fairly confident that it's working right, we write tests that verify that that stays working, right? That it meets all the requirements, that all the edge cases are all looked after, so that we don't make any regressions, that something that worked, we break now, right? Also, a lot of emphasis on continuous integration, that we automate a lot of the grunt work of having to run the test, package it, deploy it, merge things, and then move it to the production environment. So we automate all that. So heavy emphasis on that, and also acceptance testing, where we write down what we all mean by a particular task being done. Right? It doesn't mean that I have a particular meaning of what it's done, and and you have a different meaning of when something is done. That we all agree that it's done when I can guarantee that the end user looks at this and they say, yes, that is what I want. Then it's done, right? And so being able to capture those tests, those acceptance tests in the ticket, so that I don't inadvertently move my ticket to done unless all the points in the acceptance test are taken care of. So the Scrum methodology is just iteratively produce a add value to the product, and so that ideally perhaps have the product being able to be put into production at any particular time, right, or at least at any sprint, and then provide some feedback and review that can be just put into the sequence again. Other practices is that we time box everything. For instance, the time that we're going to take for sprints, 15 to 30 days, 2 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. I like shorter sprints. About two. I think a 2-week sprint is the sweet spot. I think 1-week sprints is way too short. I think 3-week sprints are a little too long. We're going to use 1-week sprints only because our sprints, the spring semester is short, right? So we want to make sure we get a chance to practice, right? The fact of starting, planning, designing, building, and then all over again. To just get a lot of practice on doing that, right? It'll be very chaotic. One sprint to the next. I think 1-week sprints are very, very chaotic. It's like the sprint started, and when it's ending, you get a sense of, wait a minute, we just started, and you get a chance to do anything. And now it's ending. Nevertheless, it'll be a good practice. We heavily based on creating user stories, where we have a very vague first approximations of the description of what is that we're going to be building, what feature we're going to be building from the point of view of the user, and we'll leave it deliberately. We leave it with no detail, with very little detail whatsoever. Only when it's decided that we're going to implement that particular feature, then we go and add the additional details. Now, user stories. Early on, when this technique of using Scrum and whatnot began, user stories were represented as just Post-it notes, right? Where you had maybe a board, a whiteboard, and you had perhaps 3 or 4 swim lanes that will allow you to show what each story what each represented by a sticky that would tell you where in the process was, whether I haven't started it yet, whether it's currently in progress, or whether I'm done. And the different colors of the sticky notes would represent what type of story it was. Is it a design story? Is it a research story? Is it an implementation story? Is it a bug? What is it? And different colors would mean different things. You know, red perhaps for bugs, right? And maybe yellow for enhancements. You know, something that has already been implemented, but I need to go back and perhaps change, tweak it here and there. And blue for new stories, new features that were going to be implemented. Typically, these were in a public area where everybody would see how this is evolving over time, perhaps in a dedicated room called the war room. Now, each story typically has a description at the top. Again, this is the placeholder that describes the role, the goal, right, as a role, and the functionality and whatnot. Also, multiple conversations back and forth as folks have been conversing amongst each other. In Jira, you would capture this in comments as folk are asking each other, "Hey, how do you build this? What are we actually writing here?" And folks would answer questions here as part of the comments, and then the done criteria at the bottom. Let's see. Oftentimes it's useful to come up with personas that describe the particular type of user that we are writing this for. Usually, saying that this is a female in their 30s with 2 kids that are picking up somebody from school, or this is a retired person in their 70s who, and you would describe, and give them names, actual names, right? And these are folks that represent the audience for which you are writing these stories for. Allow you to try and be in their shoes when you write these stories. And you will write these cards back and forth with different details and bullet points that of questions you might need to ask. How much detail? So at the beginning would be very, very few details, understanding that you'll have the subject matter expert available for being able to answer questions on certain aspects and fill out the details at a later time. All right, I'll leave it here.